How are you? Just want to share with you a very quick thought on this week's Parsha. It's so glad you clicked on the link to join us, and I hope you'll also subscribe to my channel. I try to share once in a while some quick thoughts, some inspirational thoughts, some things to think about. This week's Parsha, this week's Torah portion, talks about 7 out of the 10 plagues that God brought on the Egyptians when the Egyptians would not let the Jews out of Egypt. They served there for 210 years as slaves, and God brought in this week's Parsha 7 out of the 10 plagues upon the Egyptians. Interesting question. Okay, I'll tell you 2 halachos, 2 things, 2 insights, and then we'll see how we could reconcile the 2 of them. You've heard it here before, or perhaps you read it here before, but it's such a powerful lesson. Number 1, when the Jews were getting ready to leave Egypt, what happened? All the Jews left, and all the dogs in Egypt did not bark. They could have scared the Jews, they could have frightened the Jews. You know, when you have 3 million people doing a mass, if you'll pardon the pun, a mass exodus, all at once, you could imagine that there'd be a lot of excitement going on, there'd be energy in the air, and so on and so forth, and the dogs would get very nervous and upset. And yet, the Torah teaches us that the dogs did not bark one iota. What is the reward that the dogs got for not barking when the Jews left Egypt? From that time on, whenever a Jew had a piece of meat which was not kosher, in other words, he slaughtered an animal perhaps, or he had slaughtered on his behalf an animal that was rendered not kosher, the non-kosher meat would go to the dogs. That would be the reward for the dog for all eternity, that he gets the non-kosher meat in exchange for his not barking. Okay, that's instance number 1 having to do with the exodus from Egypt. The second plague of frogs, some people say it was crocodiles, some people say it was alligators, irrespective of what the actual animal was, what happened during that plague? Our rabbis teach us that the frogs were everywhere. They were in our beds, they were in the shower, they were in the living room, they were in the bedroom, they were in the dining room, they were all over the place. So much so that the frogs even jumped into the ovens, into the fiery ovens, so they could be baked into the bread and become part of the food. And that's how annoying and how upsetting the entire situation was. Imagine you take a nice loaf of bread out of the oven and you cut into it and rip it, and a frog jumps right out. So you would think that the frogs would get killed. Amazingly enough, Hashem made a miracle, and all the frogs that jumped into the oven survived the fiery furnace that could have been their crematorium. But God made a miracle that they survived, and they jumped out, and they lived. Okay, let's take a look at these 2 instances and try to reconcile both of them. Here we have dogs who all they did was they didn't bark, and for all eternity they are given the non-kosher meat, that meat that winds up not being not kosher. For all eternity they're rewarded for not barking. The frogs who jumped into this fiery furnace that could have been preheated to who knows much, 400, 450 degrees, they jumped right in. And yet what happened? They survived. Miraculous, yes, but then at the end of the plague, they jumped out, and that was it. They could have been chariot kill or road kill 3 minutes later, who knows? But they lived out their natural lives, and that was that. What do we learn from this? Very, very simple lesson. The world was created with speech, right? God created the world abara kedabara. I will create as I have spoken. We see the importance of speech in our everyday life, and we see from these 2 disparate rewards that it's easier to jump into a burning furnace than it is to keep your mouth shut when you're supposed to. Let's take this lesson away from this week's Parsha and redouble our efforts to when we open up our mouths to speak properly and to speak correctly. It's interesting because we have 2 ears, because it's very, very important to listen. We have 2 lips and 2 layers of teeth. And behind that, we have the tongue. Of course, life and death we know is in the power of the tongue, and yet we have to make sure to guard our tongue with such careful strength that we actually have 2 layers of protection before we open our mouth and let our tongue do what it has to do. First we have our teeth and then our lips. 2 and 2 to cover over the tongue to make sure that we don't open our mouth improperly. Once our mouth is closed, we listen with our ears. It's an amazing lesson. It's harder to keep your mouth shut than it is to jump into a raging furnace. Let's redouble our efforts, and in the merit of our guarding our tongues, we should hear only good news. Have a wonderful Shabbos.